created just a smaller presentation this time, just to kind of give an overview of what we used to think about addiction, what we sort of started to think more recently, and kind of where we're at now with addiction. When you listen to much of the discourse around addiction these days, it can sound like we know a lot. It sounds like people are very confident when they say addiction is a brain disease. And I think we can kind of have a discussion around that and see maybe if people are in practice, what they've seen, or if people themselves are in recovery and are willing to talk about that, that's great. But let's just jump in. Today's talk is going to be a little bit about rethinking addiction and recovery. So what places can we rethink and where might it be beneficial for them? Again, my background started off as a social worker. I was a street outreach worker. I was walking the streets. I was going into abandoned homes. I was talking to people in very active use. And I was talking to what people stereotypically view as people with addictions. And it matched up what I had learned in school. By the time I finished my formal, like working in clinic with people dealing with addictions, I was on the complete other end. I was working in a for-profit treatment center with, I don't like using the term high functioning, but the people who were coming with addictions there were CEOs. They were people who on the outside had a flourishing, happy life, but behind closed doors, they were dealing with addictions. My goal in starting my master's was to look and say, we have this idea of addiction, and in my personal life, I know a lot of people who have overcome addiction, come out the other side, and lived a very powerful, flourishing life. And that really didn't match with what I was taught or what I was told or the discourse on addiction. So I really started investigating that and kind of looking a little bit deeper. And here's kind of where I've gotten to. We started off, I guess I already went over this. This is kind of the outline of the talk today. I'm going to start off with the moral model of addiction. So that is kind of where we started. Move into the brain disease model of addiction, what that means for recovery, and then what the alternatives could possibly be. In the moral model of addiction, addiction is seen as a moral failing. Only bad people become addicts. Addiction is a choice. It is something that they are actively choosing to do. It's because they have something wrong with their morals. And really, all they need to do is figure that out, and that would be fine. Become good people, and that would be the end of their addiction. This was really a prevailing model, really right up until about the 80s. I'm going to hazard to say that this idea hasn't really gone away as much as people in the profession would like it to. I'd say that in the general public, the moral model of addiction is still very prevalent. What this means is that there is a great amount of stigma for people who are dealing with challenges associated with addiction. It means that very few people who aren't outwardly represented in the stereotype of addiction are going to put up their hands and say, I am dealing with addiction and I could use some help. The moral model of addiction shifted around the 1980s, ironically, because it was at the same time where in the United States, the war on drugs was occurring. But kind of at that same time, the medical and the psychological field was shifting its view on addiction from it being a pure moral choice to perhaps there's something happening within our brains that makes us more likely to be addiction. I believe they saw this as an answer to why some people get addicted and some don't. They started looking for things like an addictive gene or really just differences in the brain. And what they found, and there is clear evidence that if you are in active addiction, there are brain changes that happen, particularly within the reward center of your brain and into the prefrontal cortex where the decision making is. There's definitely changes there. The use of drugs, and this can be a little complicated as well, but in general, the use of addictive substances changes your brain fundamentally in the way that you are motivated to do things. We talk a lot in addiction about something called the nucleus accumbens. That is really the dopamine center of our brain. And dopamine acts as our motivator. When we get a hit of dopamine, we feel compelled to action. Dopamine also plays a role in movement. So without dopamine, and we wouldn't be able to move our muscles. We wouldn't be able to actually physically get through space. Sorry about the dog in the background. But this is life 2 years into COVID. When these changes happen, it can be very difficult to motivate yourself to go after anything except for your substance of choice. These changes are very real. And these changes are really what led to the idea that addiction is a chronic, relapsing brain disease. So we moved from there being a flaw within your morals to there being a flaw within how your brain functions. So I'm trying to hopefully get you to picture yourself as a person. And I know this is hard based on the stigma that is currently in place. If you are a person who is, I'm going to use myself as an example. I'm a new mother, not really a new mother, but I'm a mother with 2 children under 5. One of the biggest things in mommy culture this year is mommy needs her glass of wine. Mommy needs her glass of wine. Now, if I'm in that position and I start thinking, I wonder if I have a problem with having too much wine. And I wonder if I have an addiction. And currently the 2 models that I'm being presented are 1, I'm a bad person and I have a moral failing, or 2, I have a chronic relapsing brain disease that makes me act like this. Both are very disempowering. For someone who is a member of their community, for someone who values their standing in the community, it is very unlikely that that person is therefore going to seek treatment. So one of the challenges that we have with both definitions of addiction right now is the stigma prevents people who could use a lot of help from reaching out and getting that help because they do not want the label of being an addict. Because if you're an addict, either you're a bad person or you have a chronic relapsing brain disease that is going to continuously be there for the rest of your life and never go away. What this means for recovery, it doesn't really match up with what we see. First of all, people do recover. Addiction can be seen as a label that you have for the rest of your life. You will never, particularly with the brain disease model. Even with the moral model, you could repent and become a better person. With the current medical model, you have a chronic relapsing brain disease that could come back at any moment. Unlike things like cancer, there is no period in which we say you have reached a period of remission and now it is less likely that you are going to experience a relapse. They don't give that to people who have addictions. They say, and in many programs of treatment, addicts are told that if they let their guard down for one moment, their addiction will come back like that, which can be very terrifying and very devastating for people. The reality is that we know from longitudinal studies, one conducted by Heyman in 2013, the vast majority of people with addictions do recover. It appears that it varies by substance, and there appears to be a half-life of these substances. Cocaine addiction, the half-life is about 4 years, which means on average, people will start to just naturally move away from their addiction after about 4 years. The longest is alcohol addiction. I will make a note as well. They did not include nicotine addiction within this, which I believe would probably skyrocket the numbers and kind of throw this out. But in terms of the big things that we think of when we think of addiction, heroin or any opiates, cocaine, alcohol, there appears to be a very distinctive half-life. I've seen this in practice, and I've seen it amongst people. The challenge that comes is that due to the nature of substances, due to the physical effects of alcohol, due to the physical, mental, emotional, relational, financial impacts of addiction, it can be very difficult to fully recover. But the reality is that when people are addicted to drugs, they will eventually stop using them if they are able to maintain some semblance of a life outside of their addiction. Unfortunately, our numbers are skewed because the reality is that a lot of people who recover never seek treatment. They do not go into either AA, NA, any formal substance abuse treatment. They deal with it on their own, and they never tell anybody ever that they were an addict. We don't actually know how many people out there are in recovery from addiction because of the stigma that we attach to addiction. If you are in long-term recovery, if you have been sober for 10, 15, 20 years, you are unlikely to stand up and say, I am a person in recovery in your everyday life if nobody knows that about you. You are terrified that somebody will find out. These are the conversations that I have with people in long-term recovery and why they choose to kind of remain. These days, I see them a little bit more on the well-being coaching side. So they've left their addiction, but they're unsure how to reconcile that past person with the person they are today. And that has a little bit to do with what happens when we recover. So my thesis was based on the fact that people can flourish after long-term recovery from alcohol and substance use. The reason I thought this was, one, on the personal side and professional side, I was seeing it within clinic. There are people who are out and proud about their recovery, people like Brené Brown. Brené Brown is a person in long-term recovery. If any of you within the psych world know her, she has a new show out on Netflix. She is one of the biggest shame and vulnerability researchers in the world. She is in long-term recovery from addiction. People, like, there's celebrities all over the place who are outwardly flourishing, but who on the inside have dealt with these addictive tendencies. The thing that happens when people recover, and the one thing that they talk about more than anything, is a change in meaning and purpose. That tends to be the number one thing that ultimately changes people from being in active addiction to coming out, is that they find something that brings them meaning and purpose. In AA, that can be sponsoring people. In external life, they can have a family and get really deep meaning of that. But the number one thing that most people say brings them through from that short term, that early recovery period, through to long-term recovery, is finding meaning and purpose in their life. I don't understand how meaning and purpose in life align with the medical brain disease model of addiction. So my idea and my thoughts is that we started with this thesis. It was a moral model. We needed the antithesis, I don't know how to say that word properly, antithesis of the moral model. And so we came up with the brain disease model. The brain disease model, neither model really accounts for the entire life that the addict is in. So their life circumstances, all of that, and I'll get into that in the next slide. But one alternative that I do want to present is goes back to that reward system. So when we talked about the reward system being one of the areas impacted and shown to be impacted by MRI studies into addiction, the reward system is also deeply involved in human learning. We learn by testing things out, going out and having an experience, and having that experience either go poorly or going well. In the example of somebody with an addiction, and when I go back to my early career, when I was working with youth who were just starting to experiment with addictions, what I found is that there was two ways that they tended to get into using drugs. One, they wanted to get away from something. They wanted to stop feeling the pain. They wanted to stop the psychological thoughts that were going through their head. They didn't want to feel something. So the one side, they wanted to stop doing something. They found that when they were in pain, they ingested a substance, they took a drink, they smoked a joint, they didn't feel that anyway. In their brain, the brain says, I was in pain, I'm not in pain, this is the thing that did it. The next time they're in pain, the brain naturally is going to say, this is what worked last time, we should do that again, because our brains are inherently lazy and really just want the fastest, easiest answer. And so if they've had the experience of having something beneficial, they're going to take that. This is where sometimes the individual drugs start taking play. So in the example of an opiate, in general, that first experience is never replicated. So if you talk to people who have been through an opiate or a heroin addiction, they'll say that they experienced that. They were in some sort of pain, whether it was physical, psychological, emotional. They used heroin and it made them feel better than they've ever felt in their life. They experienced pain again. They didn't quite get up to that same use the second time they used. So they kept going back and back and back. And that repetitive nature, that repetitive, I feel pain, I use, I don't feel that anymore, becomes a pattern and becomes a habit and eventually becomes an addiction. On the other side, people who weren't trying to stop something, people were moving to something. So particularly with the youth that I was seeing, they felt naturally, like most youths do, like they wanted to fit in. They felt uncomfortable. They wanted some of that social lubricant that we all call. So they had a couple drinks. And they found that when they went out to have drinks, they were fun with their friends. They were no longer the shy person that they felt. They found that as their solution to a pain point. It either brought them to something or prevented them from going to something. These two things, when done repetitively, teaches your brain that when something happens, here's a solution. That, to a lot of developmental psychologists and a lot of developmental neuropsychologists, looks like deep learning. This looks like a behavior that has been deeply learned. In particular, a neuroscientist and person himself in long-term recovery from heroin addiction, Dr. Mark Lewis, has proposed that this is a synthesis. It doesn't discount the brain changes, the very real brain changes that we see in the brain. It doesn't discount that ultimately we are making a choice to ingest that substance. But what it does is say there's an alternative reading of these things. And what it could be is a very deep learned behavior that is reinforced by various different chemical elements based on your drug or alcohol of choice. What this means for recovery and what I've seen with people as I've started introducing this to them in treatment, these people obviously are in treatment for a reason, so I haven't necessarily reached people outside of treatment. But what this does is it accounts for more of the external factors. It accounts for the fact that people who have more adverse child experiences when they're young are more likely to have an addiction. It accounts for the fact that people who experience physical, economic, and psychological traumas are more likely to develop an addiction. It accounts for the fact that if you are in a culture or a community or a family unit that uses substance, like I said, if my children see mommy getting really stressed out and going for a glass of wine, they are more likely to do that themselves when they get to the age. None of this is accounted for really in the medical or the moral model of addiction. It is a little bit more accounted for within the learned model of addiction, because it's saying that there is an external thing or an internal process happening. You're reacting to that, and you've learned that this works from you. It gives personal agency back to the individual. So when on the flip side, when I was working with the quote unquote high functioning people dealing with addictions, one thing that they struggled with most is this idea that they have to accept that they have no control over their addiction. They did not like, I believe it's step 1 in AA, which is giving it up to the higher power and saying that you do not have control over your addiction. They did not like the medical model that said they have a chronic relapsing brain disease that can come back at them at any time, because it meant that they had no control over that. The learned model put the reins back in their hands, removing some of that moral judgment that's saying, you made this choice, so you're a bad person. It's saying you made this choice because of all these reasons. Here are some different choices to help get you out. Knowing what we know about meaning and purpose, we can connect them to that. But what it also does is takes away this idea that all people with addictions, no matter what the substance, no matter what, can have this blanket treatment, that they go into treatment. There's very standardized treatment, at least within North America, either within AA or NA. It's replicated. The 12 steps are replicated over and over again. A lot of formal treatment facilities also use that 12-step model. This requires a little bit more individualized treatment and pathways out, because everybody's connection to meaning and purpose are very different. Everybody's reasons, everybody's things that they learned to use for are different. And that's why we cannot really say that treatment is successful in any way. The treatment model, particularly in North America, and particularly where a lot of the research comes from in the United States, is based on a model that is very expensive. It makes a lot of money. And it would be nice to just keep people kind of within this system. That's kind of my conspiracy theory side. But what I think this coming together and in between, from the medical model to the moral model, This really is an opportunity for us as practitioners, for us as individuals, to flip how we see our view of addiction and how we can approach the people in our lives who we may think may be dealing with an addiction, that coming at them and saying, I think you may have a problem with addiction, is a challenge. If you come at them and say, I think that you've learned to use substance in a way that is not healthy for you, it's a different conversation. And what I think this could do, if it becomes popular, is increase the number of people coming out of the shadows, coming out of anonymity and saying, I learned that substance was good for me, and then I had to learn that it wasn't. It's not super popular amongst a lot of addiction professionals and in the addiction world. It's most popular amongst people who have dealt with addictions themselves, which for me tells me a lot about the models we have, how we treat people with addictions, and how we view people with addictions. For me, this model, and the key to this model, is the destigmatization of it being either you have a moral failing and you're always going to be a bad person, to your brain is broken and it's always going to be broken. I feel like this is a medium that gives the power back to the individual with an addiction and gives them a light at the end of the tunnel, because it also says that if you learn different strategies, you can come out of this. I will agree that you may not be able to go back to being somebody who casually drinks or who casually uses drugs. That may not be an option for you, but it doesn't mean that you have to live with this shadow, or like some people in recovery will say, their addiction is not necessarily out in the parking lot doing push-ups, waiting to jump out at you at any moment. What this could do for me, and I hope that more research comes, is give people that same time frame or that same goal to get to that many people surviving cancer do, and to say, you know what, I've reached this period and I can now say that I am in remission from substance use disorder. That's kind of a broad overview. I have a lot more to say, I'm sure, but my goal with this is really to open a conversation. I want to move away from this idea that experts have all the answers, and just because a brain scan said that this is it, and this is what we're running through from. I want to hear what people are talking about. I want to hear what people are seeing in their careers, in their day-to-day, and how some of this alternative thinking could help either them with their own addiction, their family members with addiction, or their clients and patients with addiction.